get coffee.
Yeah, please do.
That's the Upper East Side.
Hey, fellas, Peter's reporting no audio or video on Facebook.
It was just pre-roll.
Okay. Roger.
I'm not going to New York after I started taking her suitcase. She started cussing me out. I got in trouble with it.
I bet you did.
All right, well, welcome back. We'll get started here. We have not had any rigorous topic of 2 tables. I will speak to each one of these 2. We will now designate a role for each table.
Yes.
I see one immediately suggests itself. I think it's going to happen naturally. I won't have to suggest it. Okay, good. I will toss it up to you first before we start. Does anybody want to nominate a topic other than the upcoming debate? If so, I would like to talk about that. If not, then we'll roll into that upcoming debate topic. Is anybody dying to talk about something that's been actively suppressed by what's been going on over the course of the last couple of weeks? No. Okay, then into it. Feel free to interject it at any time, as always.
Remember the time you and I debated this?
Right here.
Is that where it's going to be this time?
In this room. No, it's going to be in the sanctuary.
I won that debate.
Hands down. Handily. Yes.
Not.
All right. Feedback so far. I can send out the next section here in a second, but I want to talk pictures for a second. Well, let me talk 2 topics on the cosmological argument and then on the design argument. On the cosmological, something that comes up, something Loftus has said in the past has been, people have constantly cited Stephen Hawking saying all of the evidence from modern cosmology is that the universe began to exist in an event called the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. He said that back in the 90s. And obviously theists like to...
Loftus didn't say that back. Loftus said that back.
Hawkins. Yeah. So it's a great place to go to, like an eminent physicist that everybody recognizes.
It must be true.
And he's an atheist. So if he's on the side of atheism and he says all the scientific evidence is that the universe began to exist, then you sort, even though it's using an argument from authority, you still cite it to say even the preeminent atheist, mathematical physicist, says that the universe began to exist.
Loftus is saying that.
Loftus brought up one time that I can find. He says these apologists keep acknowledging. Well, he brought up the following point: the apologists keep ignoring the fact that Hawking changed his mind about this. So that's not technically true. What happened was Hawking and Hartle, closer to the end of Hawking's life, wrote No Boundary Condition. His book, The Grand Design, was the attempt to popularize it, which basically says this. So here's the dot of the singularity, and then that dot gets bigger and bigger over time in very, very short periods of time. And it's supposed to continue down to a singularity, mathematically speaking, if you assume a continuous reality and physical reality. But when you get to something like 1 times 10 to the negative 33rd seconds after the Big Bang, you get into what he's trying to say is like fraction of a second. Hawking is saying if you use, so mathematically what he's doing is using a mathematical model that is trying to basically take 2 manifolds, a 3-dimensional manifold, so think of it as a sphere, and a 4-dimensional manifold, which is a sphere running in with another axis in time. So let's just create some, something to designate that these 2 manifolds are different manifolds. And all of this analytic geometry tries to create what they call a smooth mapping between every point on one manifold to another point on another manifold. So this mapping function is the kind of math that Hawking works in. And what he found out is if you build these manifolds, this one right here that represents the real world. This is the one that Einstein worked in. This is called a de Sitter space. This is basically what our model of the universe looks like right here. And he tries to map it down to a three space, a 4 space to a 3 space. And he does so by using, as I probably put in there, a wick rotation, which is just fancy words for you obviously can't map 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions and have everything. You can, like a Mercator projection. You had the world and you put it all out there, but there's distortion in it each time. And if you're going to take an axis out completely, you say, what did we lose? When you map a Mercator projection to a sphere, what you lose is the fact that there's depth in there. That at no point in there can you say, without doing some other math, Beijing and London are how far apart from each other in real life in 3 dimensions. So you know how far apart they are if you follow some line of latitude, or you can draw a point from one to the other, and it's not going to be a straight line on a Mercator projection, but you can say, I can measure that distance. But that's not the shortest distance between 2 points. It's the shortest distance on that surface. So when you do this kind of manifold mapping, you miss, something is lost. And you plug it back in, and I think this would be controversial philosophically, but it's true. You plug it back in by using the complex plane. So these guys run this mapping.
Plug it back in. Plug what back in?
Complex math takes, basically gives you a plane where the real numbers run along or this line, and the complex numbers in this one. And the way that you plot this one is by calling this 1 plus, 1 square root of -1 kind of thing. So you've got this complex portion of it that all you did was put, this, as far as I'm concerned, using this allows you to put it into a rotational framework that uses sine, cosine. But all you did was add, this could be plus apple or pear if you wanted to, and this is the apple axis and the pear axis. You've added something that's not real to it and said that's going to extend it, and you got a dimension out of it for free. So this is the reason they use the term imaginary, is because that's not a real thing, that's an imaginary thing. So you can do this, but you have to use imaginary numbers in order to do so. So I'm trying to explain it as fully as I know how to.
You said you can plug it back in.
The time dimension. So here, This is 3 spatial dimensions. This is 3 spatial dimensions plus 1 time dimension.
Gotcha.
Over here. And this time dimension, what Hawking did in his math was he does a wick rotation, which lets you use the complex plane to represent this one, and he rolls the time dimension back into a spatial dimension, according to him. And it does kind of emerge at a place where you're at 1 times, or I think 3 over lambda, where lambda is the factor that Einstein used that he said was his biggest mistake, but turned out to maybe be important, that has to do with balancing the equations, the Einstein field equations for the universe spatially. So when you do this, it is the case that your mathematical mapping goes from geometric to non-geometric, and that's the break point, so to speak. So he uses that kind of naturally occurring breakpoint that occurs because of the math you're using. Like it has to occur because of the math you're using to say that's where the spatial dimension, like as you go backwards along this line, you've got 4D, 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 where it's 3 space and 1 time, and then you hit this point right here, and it becomes 3, the time dimension rolls up into another spatial dimension, according to him. So what he's saying is, this is the beginning of time. That's the idea.
Well, that seems very problematic.
It is
based on the assumption that you started in 3D space and then got to 4D.
Well, the even more so is the fact that these right here, this moved to this point and this moved to this point.
Yeah.
Those are changes in size. So the radius of the universe changes, but he's claiming it's not changing in time. Yeah. Now, there's a problem with this, that even if it were the case that mathematically you ignored the fact that this was literally imaginary in terms of numbers, and you said, okay, however, the universe is still expanding in size over this what? This interval of what?
Yeah,
interval of space? It's an interval of time. So metaphysically, I want to make the point that anything that changes happens in time. And this seems to be widely recognized. I don't know anybody who says that. The only way says differently. The only way to say differently is to claim something like, you don't understand because you don't understand analytic geometry. It's rolled back up into a spatial dimension, so it changes in space without changing in time. And then you say, yeah, but metaphysically, what do you mean by it changes in space without happening over an interval? of time. So
mathematical model that misses the boat.
So as you can imagine, this part of the discussion is not so easy to have in front of an audience of lay people who have no idea what the word analytic geometry, the words analytic geometry even mean. Yes, sir.
I took analytical geometry and I still don't know
I think a lot of people who write in analytic geometry don't know what it is.
Stepping outside the debate for just a moment, and just looking at this, I'm curious how nothing can change outside of time. We've known this, but what is God deciding to create the universe? Is that a change?
So
in his mental state.
You may remember this from the paper. You may not remember the paper, but here's in my mind. So let these dots represent not an interval of time, but a point. And so if you're going to have an interval of time, however small that interval, you got to go from one dot to the other. Okay, so these dots represent change from one state to another. So here's state 1, here's state 2, here's state 3, and so that becomes T0, T1, T2, something like that. Let's make these as minimal as possible, arbitrarily small, however you want to say it. In reality, in a continuum, these are going to have to be arbitrarily small, which means they could be smaller if you wanted them to be. And these states could be parsed more tightly. My argument has been about the Trinity, has said this point right here is our MGB in his atemporal state. Okay, so this portion, if you drew the line right here, everything on this side is just God and any abstract objects that exist necessarily, if there are any. So if math exists necessarily, it exists here too. If math is a mental construct, then it exists in the mind of God, and it's all there. And if this is an atemporal state, there's no changing. So God's not doing like, what's going on now? What should I do? Hey, I've got a decision to make. None of that's happened. So presumably what is happening in this state is God supposedly, at this point, according to standard theology, knows all true propositions. And if he knows all true propositions, the question is, do all true propositions include future propositions? So does God know the future? And if he knows the future, it also is, does he know conditional? And this conditional. And this line right here is the difference. This is standard Christianity. That's completely not spelled right. Whatever. Christianity. And this one right here is Molinism. So if he knows future conditional things, David, the Philistines, the city would give you up to the Philistines if you go there. If Nineveh doesn't repeat, then God would destroy them, that kind of thing. If God also knows future conditionals, he knows all these things in virtue of knowing all true propositions. So the Molinist thinks God knows all of this before any change has occurred. The point that I have also made, and I'll get back to this in a second, is that here's the world, and then here's the in its initial state. Okay, whatever the initial state is, as soon as the world is created, or let's say not even the world just of necessary objects. And here's possible world 1, and here's possible world 2, and here's possible world 3, ... to possible world n. So here are all the ways the world could be. And then there's, this one could also go to P1.1, it could go to P1.2. These are all the different ways that world could then be, and so on. And so it goes like this. In all of these are all the possible worlds out there. These are all available worlds for, assuming these are all possible and feasible, further feasible, that God then turns around and says, which one of these do I want to actually do? So at some point, God makes a choice to actualize P2, P1.2, P1.2.3, or
well,
whatever.
he doesn't at some point make the choice because,
well, hold on. Here's the actual world. So this one is also the actual world. If he knows all true propositions, then he also knows what his choices will be in the future, which means he knows which possible world he will actualize, which means he knows what the actual world would be, which means he doesn't have to make a decision to do it in time, because in virtue of knowing all true future conditional propositions, he already knows what choice he's going to make. So he doesn't have to sit there in atemporal existence and say, which of these will I choose, because he already knows which one he will choose because he knows all future conditional.
They also talk about illogical instance of time. What a priori, what priority does do those logical instants. It doesn't mean that happened in time. So it would have happened, that decision would have happened contemporarily.
Yes.
That's the word, right? With the actual creation.
Yeah, to this point, I think what you could say right here is, if you wanted to break them strictly in order, you would say this is God atemporally, and then this is his decision to create, and then this is creation showing up. So these could happen at the same time. His decision to create is concurrent with creation popping up, which makes sense to me. Or you could say his decision is kind of quote unquote one step, one change before creation pops into existence. But in any case, you get atemporal into temporal. Craig says that when that occurs, the atemporal God steps into time. I turn around and say maybe atemporality is an essential property, in which case God, in virtue of having to be omnipresent, because that's what a naturally great being would do, at the decision or instantiation, the actualization of an actual world, gains another consciousness that's temporal. So he now has two consciousnesses, one that's atemporal and one that's temporal.
Really?
And that's how I get two of the Trinity, and the third comes from another decision. But that's how the Trinity would, if it's the case that it's logically possible for a single being to have three consciousnesses, which the Christian is forced to argue in any way,
Right.
then the next question is atemporality an essential trait? If it's an essential trait to God, then he can't abandon it, because if he did, he'd fail to be God at that point. So he has to have both of them.
Why would it be essential?
Any property that God possesses at this point right here is an essential property, because it is what there is no space, so to speak, for accidental properties yet, because no change has occurred. So every property he's got at that point is essential. The question is something like atemporal, that means not temporal, is the negation of a property an actual positive property?
Yeah.
So because you could say he's a creational at this point. He hasn't made a creation, but it's not essentially the case that he necessarily has no creation in the future. So you have to have an interaction with what actually comprises a property.
Just to unpack really quick what I thought I heard you say. God he's not making the choice to create because he already knows that he's going to create?
Yes.
But then, does he not have a choice?
It seems that he does have a choice, because there's one possible world where it's just, here's the necessary world, and possible world 1, it just is that necessary world with no creation. Possible world 2 is God creates.
But how can you say that he doesn't have a choice when he does have a choice?
I didn't say he doesn't have a choice.
I thought you said that.
No, what I said, he doesn't have to choose in time in order to make that choice.
Oh, he chose.
So think about how do you make a choice? We make a choice in virtue of two things happening. We are exposed to information. The information, maybe multiple bits of information, but we're exposed to information. Let's think about breakfast. We already have a desire. We wake up with the desire to eat breakfast. Okay, we didn't have to make that decision. We wake up and it's there. Now we may sense that, but let's say that it's just sitting there in the background. We already desire to have breakfast. We then say, maybe without even saying it, I know I want to eat breakfast. So we come downstairs, or let's say that we woke up literally in front of the pantry shelf, and we're like, I have, Cheerios and I have Chex. I could have either one of those. Which one do I want? So it was the first, you see that the two choices are there. So first we perceive, then we label, and then we make a decision based on what our preference was at the time, and based on that decision we then could conduct an action. God doesn't have to go through the perceived state, and because he doesn't have to go through the perceived state, and presumably also knows what the best choice would be. So for us, the best choice may be down to, am I on a diet? If so, then it's Special K instead of Honey Nut Cheerios or something like that. God doesn't need to do that because he already knows what the best choice is going to be. So he doesn't have to go through any mental process in order to make the selection, nor does he have to go through a sensory process in order to determine what the selection would be. Already in his mind are all the possible worlds. Already in his mind are which of those worlds would be optimal. I have talked about in the past, maybe size is what he chooses. So it's somebody knows all the sizes. So if anything, the only thing he does is say, I choose a world of size X. And that would then be the next dot in your timeline. So he becomes temporal. At least one portion of his consciousness becomes temporal at that point.
You didn't mention the Planck era and all the problems that creates.
Yeah. So that wasn't strictly the Planck era, but the ideas are similar. Yeah. The Planck epoch, remember the Planck epoch is not a thing that emerges from reality. The Planck epoch was the Planck length. The Planck epoch comes from just whatever the length was from the beginning of the singularity, from the singularity's beginning to expand to the amount of time that it takes to go through the Planck epoch, a single measure of Planck time. Planck time is the smallest amount of time that we think we'll ever be able to detect. It doesn't mean anything about reality. That was human beings basically, not wrongly, saying, giving up and saying, based on what we know about physics, we'll never be able to measure a time slot smaller than this.
Right.
And since we'll never be able to measure a time slot smaller than this, at the time, their philosophy said, if you can't measure it, then it's meaningless or not real. Turns out the philosophy behind that was defunct, and people have since said that's garbage, that's provably false. But the problem is we've stuck with it. We shouldn't, but at the end of the day, the Planck length or Planck epoch is nothing other than physicists being like, we'll probably never be able to measure anything smaller than this, so we're going to deal with that like it's some real facet of the universe, because it's at least a limitation for us when we're making our models.
So I see what seems to be a problem with your view of the Trinity, in that God temporal, if that's a different part of the Trinity, it's not. It doesn't always exist like God. And that if it's there's God atemporal, and then he steps into time, and that makes Christ, then Christ is no longer like God in every way. He's no longer fully God.
So here's the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and they are all co-eternal and existent because they're all, at this point, atemporal. If it's the Son, by whom and through whom and for whom everything was created, then perhaps it seems like the Son may be the engine of creation, may be the one who actually does the creation. So if that's the case, then the Father doesn't step into time. The Son exists atemporally with the Father, and this, by the way, is Philo. This is not me. This is not anybody else. This is the Word of God moving forth from the mind of God into the world. So he thought of this well before this time. And so the Son and presumably the Spirit then move into time. So this is, you could call it, I don't like to call this time here, because this is not the front end of an interval. To me, a time interval is the space between the beginning of the interval and the end of the interval. So the Father exists at t z, because he's not on the other side of an interval. He stays in this spot the whole time. This is t0 for the Son and the Spirit, and this is t1, and this is t2, onward down. Why the Spirit? Well, if in the atemporal past, the Father from time eternal, or from the atemporal, I prefer to say from atemporal state, had the eternal desire to have God step into a restricted existence. A restricted existence would be an existence where God does not have all the properties, has a consciousness that does not have all the properties that God typically has. So the question is this: is it logically possible for God to become a man? And if the answer is yes, and by man we mean not some hidden Superman where he secretly has all these powers, but like you and me, man, where there's stuff you don't know because your brain housing group doesn't contain the power to think about it. Or you might not know future events. So you might say something like this: nobody knows the time except for the Father, not the Son, nor the angels in heaven. So if it's the case that God was going to limit himself and he's going to be born as a baby, who's sustaining the existence of the universe? Well, if the Father is sustaining, then he's acting. And if he's acting, then he's not atemporal. If the Son is busy being a baby and can't extend the universe, then who's doing that? Well, it's the Spirit that is sustaining the existence of the universe. Now, whether the Spirit has done that from the beginning or not, is a matter for debate and theology. But ultimately, because God eternally intended to restrict himself into being a man, you necessarily end up with a omni-conscience, so I'll say omni-conscience at all times, and an omni-conscience at some times, some and all, and an atemporal consciousness. This is why you have three. It emerges necessarily. It's not some random choice. It's that way necessarily. So it's not that the Trinity is a possible construct. It's given that God wanted a world in which he would step into it. Necessarily, there are three persons to the Trinity. If God did not create anything, if it was just him, he would only be one person. But the fact that the actual world was the one that he intended to create here means that necessarily you'll have three. This was my paper.
What do you say omniconscious? Is that just...
Personal.
At all points, at all times t, God knows all truth propositions. All true propositions, yeah.
Yeah. So what about presence, too?
Question for you. We're here on a Skype, Zoom, whatever, to Indonesia, some city in Indonesia. We see their room completely. Are we there? No, why not? What's the difference between being here in this room and being there?
Physical location.
But what? So, I mean, you see that physical, you perceive that physical location. You perceive this physical location. So here you perceive this, but you don't perceive that. I mean, you do perceive that too. What's the difference? And let's say that we came up with a technology that lets us, instead of looking at this 2D projection, that their room is exactly the same size as our room, and it projects into the other side, so it's almost like there's a piece of glass here, but you can see through the glass into a room that looks just like this over there. Singapore, or Indonesia, wherever I said, on the other side, and us here. So you perceive it, there's just a wall of glass between it. What's the difference? Why do you say you're here rather than there?
Maybe you are there because of entanglement.
Okay, forget quantum entanglement, right, maybe so. But let's say, forget the fact that you're in those effects. We'll grant, for the sake of argument, that we're in the same field space in terms of electromagnetic fields and all that kind of stuff. So we share the space in that sense already. We're gravitationally interacting with them, possibly. So, but why is it we wouldn't say we're there, right? We would say on the other side, like, you guys should come over here. Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, that's where it seems like it's entirely just definition dependent, because you can say, oh, well, you have no ability to exercise your will. Then yeah, well, technically, if I move a little bit farther from Indonesia, I'm tugging them more.
But what you just said is the important part to me. Say it again, the first part.
It's entirely dependent on your definition of present.
Next point about will.
You can't exercise your will.
Okay, so Michael, somebody in Indonesia says something that offends him greatly. They insult his wife. And he stands up and says, this will cost you blood, I'm on my way. In order for him to do something about it, he can't walk through the glass. He's got to turn around. He can use his elocution can be perfect, and perhaps he can, with words, cause significant damage on the other side. But if he wants to do physical damage, he wants to exercise his will that includes physical power. He's not physically there because he can't physically act. Right. I insult his wife. He can stand up and physically act. It's going to take him some time to do so because he's got to cross the space from here to there. But it would be a short time compared to a long time. But the difference is physical ability. If I'm sitting right next to him, his ability to act is much quicker than that. So it turns out that it's the ability. It's not just perception, but it's the ability to perceive and act. If it's the case, however, that Michael is a Marvel superhero with telekinesis, then the person, or he's Darth Vader. Then when I insult his wife, I get force choked, right? And we saw Vader do this, right? Then he force choked somebody across the admiral, right? He just boom, goes down. He's like, "You're promoted," to the other guy, Captain.
How do we know that Michael is not Darth Vader?
We don't know that, which is why I bring this up. I'm trying to irritate him enough that I get choked out, and then you all know. And I would probably run, as the little girl said, "Don't talk back to Darth Vader, or he'll get you." Have you seen that video? The summary. 4-year-old summarizes Star Wars. Best video on the internet. She does it in 2 minutes or less. Michael force chokes the guy in Singapore. So is he there now?
Well, so this is where I feel like.
But the point, and you see the point I'm getting to, which is if God can both perceive and act anywhere, He doesn't have to have a physical body there. So your physical form
Right.
is here, but your ability to project power is strictly dependent on your physical form. God's ability to project power is not dependent on his physical form. As a result, if what we mean by being there is my ability to physically act in the space, then God is present out of his power to act anywhere.
Sure, it's
But is
possibly
Jesus
active.
present or is the Spirit present?
That's the question.
That's
So,
also, yeah, that's what I'm curious about. You've separated consciousness.
so I think the Father is not. The Father is not. By the way, this is God.
So
This is very important. This is God. Okay? The Father is not omnipresent. The Father is omniscient. Maybe omnipotent, but omniscient. The Spirit is omnipresent. The Son is intermittently omnipresent. If you think he's omnipresent now in virtue of being, maybe he's not anymore. Maybe after he becomes in his human form, maybe he's no longer omnipresent. Unless presence is dictated by the ability to project power in the physical world. If he's given omniscience back, and it seems like in the time in the world that it's through the power of the Spirit that he does what he does. Now, does that mean that that's because the Spirit is the entity that's metaphysically connected between God's consciousness and the physical world? So he is working through the Spirit because the Spirit's consciousness is the connection to all that. If so, now your problem is solved.
Why do you think it being atemporal is not conditional, but being omnipresent would be conditional?
Essentially, you mean?
Essentially.
Yeah. Because there is no physical space at T naught. That's why. If I understood your question right.
So I'm sort of wrestling with how is it one nature if you split them temporally? I mean, three persons.
Yes.
But at some point, and maybe Jesus in your model decided, okay, this is the time in which I'm going to enter human life, right?
Yeah.
But at some point, the Father also knows that. He knows all. So does he know, okay, now is now? You know what I mean?
Yes. So I think the Son and the
kind of
Spirit.
wrestling with that.
So the Son and the Spirit have knowledge of tensed propositions.
Right.
The Father doesn't have knowledge like that. He sees the whole thing. So maybe he sees all of time like B-theory time.
But how does he even see all the time if he's not in time to?
Because he also, not only does he know the fact that
So how do you
Scott
even
will
know
facilitate
there's a
solid
start
ground.
here or there if you don't?
Because the Father knows the following propositions that are temporally labeled. When Scott is 48 years old and 4 days old, then he will facilitate solid ground at this location, blah, 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 blah. When he's 49 years old, he's been thrown out by the table of the old with the support of the table of the young and in a coup. And so he's no longer the facilitator of solid ground.
Present company accepted.
Present company,
Yeah,
accepted.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Oh, a lot.
right. You're granted a dispensation of being the link between the two. So these are all of these physical locatable facts, Scott in solid ground at whatever, have a temporal label to them.
Right.
And this is atemporal existence, this is temporal existence. In atemporal existence, God knows all of those. He just knows them with the labels.
He knows them.
With the labels of what time they occur. So what he can't say right then is, what he can say is, if Scott at that time, we're going to make up a time number, time 3,874, says, I know that it is, 9:15 right now. So that's a temporal fact of, right now, the time currently is not 9:15, but whatever it is. The time currently is 9:46. So that's a fact that I know right now, but that's because I know where I exist in time. The Spirit in the temporal world would be like, yeah, no, he's right. For him, in this particular gravitational well, it is 9:45 according to this clock, according to this agreed upon time, according to all these other things. But the Father doesn't, his knowledge doesn't work like that because he's not in time.
So I understand that. I'm just wrestling with, and I'm having a hard time putting in words because I haven't thought about it like this before. But how do you have a relationship between the Trinity, which is different than you and me, right? We don't have the same nature. You know,
Right.
We're not the same, and yet have some be in time and some not. It seems like there's a tear there.
Yeah, so I think that this is one of the reasons that the Spirit is who the Spirit is our relationship to the Father happens through the Spirit. I think that that's fairly unorthodox. That's fairly orthodox Christianity to say it's our interactions. God interacts with us via His Spirit, and presumably the same way back. So I happen to think
it's not us. I'm talking between the Trinity.
Right.
Yeah.
When Christ prays to God and says Father,
yes,
he's praying to God the Father. This would be a temporal to atemporal interaction, which sort of breaks your theory.
Yeah. How does
It maintains that you cannot act within temporal space.
So allow me to repair the theory, if you will.
Okay.
Here is the library. This is a library of all true propositions. And it is, when is it filled up, temporally speaking?
It was already filled.
Yeah, but when is it filled up, temporally speaking? Atemporally, it was already filled. Temporally, when is it filled up?
At the end of
time, right? So whatever that is. If time has an end, it's filled up at the end of time. If it doesn't have an end, it continues forever. I happen to think time has an end.
Well, so I'm not understanding, because...
Hold on, I'll finish it for you. When Jesus is praying to the Father, he's filling in this point, this book, this part of the book. And then later he fills in this part of the book. And then here we are over here, and we fill in this part of the book. We're filling this thing in the whole time. The Father, that's when it gets written, but the Father knows it the whole time because he sees it, so to speak, all together.
So that's where it doesn't make sense in that the library already exists. All of this is already written, right? Like
not for you, it doesn't.
Not for me, but that doesn't change the fact that the library exists and this is all written.
That depends on whether you think temporal becoming is real. So, I don't think if the library already exists, then B theory time is true.
It exists in that, it existed in God the Father's mind, right? Like when Christ says that the book of, right, like pray that you're added to the book, like when it talks about the book of life, right? Like God already has the knowledge, the library. He already knows.
Permit me an example.
All that is.
God gives you, we open the door over there and a Palantir falls out, straight out of Lord of the Rings, directly into this classroom.
Right.
And you set it on the thing, and you look into it, and you see, like she did in the movie but didn't in the book, you see your child, a child that you're going to have in the future. Mm-hmm. Does that child exist?
So this is where I think that if you're God the Father, I think that your entire view is problem. I used to think something
Fair
very
enough.
similar.
Let me ask the question differently. For you, does the child exist?
No.
Why not?
Hasn't happened yet.
Okay. Same is true for the Father.
No.
Yes. So hold on, look what happened. You have knowledge of the child. In fact, you maybe know a whole bunch of stuff about the child. Physical appearance, name, time in your life that shows up, all that stuff. So all these true propositions you know, let's pretend this is true too. All these true propositions you know, yet it's not yet real. For God, the Father, over here atemporally, none of this is real until it happens.
All is. So this is where I would disagree that if you are atemporal, this whole idea, when you said does he know the future? That's an illogical question. There is no future for God. Right? Like when you say, does he know the future? I would say he knows what we call the future because to him it's the present and the past. All simultaneously. And so when we talk about he decided, right? Like God the Father, he does, right? He says, I am God, I do not change. There's a whole host of problems here where God is changing, God is experiencing new information. There is limitation that's being introduced by his own action, and the assumption that the atemporal cannot interact with temporality. So I see just a whole host of problems.
Let me see if this repairs the problems at all.
If what you're saying is correct, though, that God realizes when things become actual, right? Isn't that in time? Doesn't he know that this is now actual?
The Spirit does.
Like God doesn't?
But God does, because God is not. God.
I'm not arguing with him. I'm just trying to
So this is the important distinction. If the idea of the Trinity is true, something like this has to be true as well. God is not one of them, the consciousnesses. God is all of the consciousnesses.
Well, the Father is.
So it's possible for the Father is not temporal. So for a God to be omnitemporal, he has to exist in time as well. But if this model is right, the Father doesn't exist in time, but the Father and the Spirit exist in time. So together you can say those two consciousnesses possess omnitemporality and atemporality.
But then they're not fully God.
They are fully God.
No, and that you've divided God, who has different properties, and then Jesus Christ is not fully God, and that if God is atemporal, he is not atemporal. Christ is no longer fully God.
Are you saying that God, that all of the persons of the Trinity, in order to be fully God, have to possess all the properties?
Oh, I don't think so.
Because the Father has the property of begetting the Son, and the Son has the property of being begotten by the Father. Those are not the same properties. In fact, they're mutually exclusive. So it can't be the case, if Trinitarianism is true, that the gods, all the persons of the Trinity, have identical properties in order to be divine. What has to happen for the Trinity to be God, rather than the Trinity to be three gods, is that each one of those together have to have, in total, all the properties that we ascribe to God,
right.
But they can't lack any properties that they could logically have, right. Which is why the division here is down to logical possibility, not to whim. Of God was like, let's delegate. Spirit's going to get this, Son's going to get that. Doesn't happen that way. It happens necessarily from what God's intent is.
Dennis,
oh, sorry.
Say something.
Stephen and Dennis, if that was.
So I was trying to figure out how to interpret just broadly to Exodus when Moses is like, hey, I want to see you. He's like, no, I'm going to pass by you. You go in the crowd to the rock. And the question would be, who was it that passed through?
Yes.
And then kind of in that separately but related, it said, my presence will go with you, with the nation. And so the question, like, what presence, so I guess it's two questions.
Yep.
So like what did Moses kind of see but not see?
So the second question first, because it's easier because we talked about it. If presence, like in our example, is temporal sensation and knowledge plus power to act, then you've got two candidates that it could be, which is the Son and the Spirit, but not the Father, because the Father is atemporal outside of this. To your question of what back do you see, I'll ask a second question in order to sharpen this question. When is God a cloud? But the cloud fills the temple, and we say that's the presence of God. But God is not a cloud. So we say who, we see a body, and we're like, who's that? And the answer is it's Dennis. And what we mean is Dennis is the mind that is steering this car, physical form that we call Dennis around. The real Dennis is the mind. But the Dennis here is physically restricted to this area, and he looks like a bipedal, a featherless biped, right? It could be that in the possible world, we take Dennis's brain and we go stick it into a tiger somewhere, and we're like, that's Dennis. And if a mind can fit in a tiger, have all that discussion. But it seems logically possible, maybe not feasible. For God, because God could quote unquote take the form of a cloud, or he could take the form of a human being. So it's a projection of who God is. He is not this. He's not a body. In the same way, he's not a cloud. In the same way, he's not a pillar of fire or a pillar of cloud. It's simply a physical indicator for us who are highly dependent on physical location and interaction in order to understand anything. He's like, let me make it easy for you. Here you go. This is why I keep telling the kids, like, you don't believe in God because you wouldn't look at the pornography if your dad was standing next to you. You wouldn't look at the pornography if Jesus was standing next to you, but you would do it knowing that God sees everything that you do. Like, something's inconsistent here. It helps us to have somebody standing next to us to be like, oh yeah, somebody knows about this. Right? The shame should have been the same either way, but it's not because they didn't have the physical thing. God does physical stuff for us so that we get it.
What does
My opinion.
what if the multiverse really exists? What if there are millions, an infinite number of universes? What does that do to this idea of atemporality? It's different for every universe.
Yeah, you can imagine that thing right there is let each one of those lines be a world track. You could just do this a near infinite number of times. So I think that it's logically impossible for an actual infinite to exist, but bottom line is you could continue process-wise to split and split and split and split so that these got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in number. Yeah, I happen to think that reality looks like this. This this is God atemporally, and then he creates creation, and then he gets a whole bunch of people and stuff. And eventually, and this is things kind of finding them, as we like to say, finding themselves, right? They find themselves. And once they're done finding themselves, and this would not be a single line, this line would go back and forth. Once they find themselves and they say, who am I? Then the next question is, who do I want to be, given who I am? And the answer is, I want to be this one of the sons of the Father. And so now they start conforming back to the image of Christ, who is the image of the Father. So in our space. And we get closer and closer and closer. You note these lines converge. So whatever our individual differences are, we are conforming ourselves to the image of Christ. We're being conformed to the image of Christ, who is also the image of the Father. And eventually, the best way I can describe this one is for those who are married or have a boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're at that place where you love them so much, but you don't have to tell them anymore. You don't have to say, I love you. You don't have to do the things for you, that you can both sit in a room under a blanket with a warm fire and a book. And this is one of my favorite things. Maybe it's not whatever your thing is. And without interacting with the person, you exist in this level of love that is no more diminished by the fact that you're not expressing the love than it would be if you were expressing the love, because the person's like, you don't have to say it, I already know it. You're happy being in their presence. And you're happier being in their presence than you would be if you were in a hotel room with all the exact same creature comforts. Somehow it's different, the fact that you're in their presence. At the end of time may look like all of us existing in the same kind of state that the Father did up here, which is that we now know, because we don't have the limitations of a wet chemical rain, we now know all of maybe God has taught us everything by that point. So now we know everything he does, and now we can exist atemporally content. I don't know that that's how it ends, but that's logically possible, and it brings time to an end, and it brings everybody in confirmation with the Son, and it brings everybody in relationship with the Father, and we're all in the presence of the Almighty and each other. We love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. What more is there to do? Lewis has upward and inward, with more and more reality as it goes on indefinitely. I say, why not? I mean, I say no. Why not get to the point where it becomes content without having to do anything?
How does that address the multiverse, where you got many universes all ending at different times?
The end of those times all is linked up in virtue of the fact that they all intersect with atemporality at the other end, that they are no longer temporal at that point. So the end of each one of
more
those.
Importantly, that even the multiverse, because of entropy, right? Had some sort of beginning, right? So it doesn't erase the issue of there was some sort of beginning.
Yeah, Dennis, if it helps, like a multiverse would be, let's say it's a constant quantum level Planck lengths and Planck time splitting of the universe, right? So you get a geometrically increasing number of universes based on the number of Planck lengths that are present and Planck epochs that are present. So I mean, this thing launches off like this instantly, and they're all different. So by the way, metaphysically extravagant, to say the least, completely unevidenced, and only exists in reality because of a desire to multiply probabilistic resources to explain what's otherwise fairly obviously designed. But that pejorative set of statements aside, which I will try to make more eloquently soon, this right here still converges down to a single point.
2 points.
I think just 1 point.
Well, yes.
Okay.
But 2 in your other model.
That's true.
It depends on
Touche.
which
That's
model.
right.
I'm of 2 minds. I wanted to bring this back to the original discussion, which was, given that we know that Loftus is going to say that Dawkins changed his mind on this, how do we actually succinctly defeat that before it comes out of his mouth, so to speak? But selfishly, this is such an interesting discussion, and I really want to know, given this model of the Trinity, and now that we know what the Trinity is, definitely.
Yes, right, that's it. There's no debate whatsoever, right?
We've solved the Trinity.
Right.
What exactly happened?
What are we doing tomorrow, boys?
Yeah. What exactly happened on the cross when God abandoned Christ and Christ descended?
Show me the verse where it says God abandoned Christ.
He took on sin, and God cannot look at sin.
That's what we say theologically. Where is that in the Bible?
Theologically,
Show me the verse. Show me the verse.
It's metaphorical.
Show me the verse at all.
Well, I mean, there's all this stuff in the Old Testament where it says that the scapegoat takes on the sin of the people,
Yep.
and then later it says that Christ is the scapegoat for
Okay.
us, which the
So what?
implications that he bears our sins.
Okay, so what? Why does that mean the Father turned his back on the Son?
You think Christ is just quoting scripture?
If you want to point out, so what does he quote? My God, why have you forsaken me? What else gets said in that psalm? It's the cross psalm. They divided up my garments among them. They cast lots for my. All that is contained in there. They didn't have. It wasn't known as Psalm. What is it? It's not 53. What's the psalm? 22. It's not known as Psalm 22 to the locals. When you want to say what it is, when you want to say to label it, you list the first verse and people know that's the psalm. He's just calling attention to, like, in case anybody's wondering what's going on here, check your memory on Psalm 22. Mm-hmm. Right? It's simply a way to point out to everybody that's going on, this is what you're doing. Maybe. That's a possible explanation. But a better explanation than metaphysically the Father has decided that even though he sees sin all the time and says that he sees sin all the time, how do we know that? Because he's constantly talking about the sin of the Amalekites has reached me, the sin of the whatever. I've seen your sin. I know this. David, this is what happened. Like, he sees sin. We can't say he's so holy he can't look on sin. Really? He seems to know an awful lot about something he can't look at. And by the way, he's keeping books on it. Thank you. And presumably he knows what's in the books. So he can't look on sin. That's not a good explanation. We have overinterpreted that when he was I think he was simply referencing it. Now, in another sense, you could be like, he's asking there's a possible world where the Father doesn't require the Son to die, like excruciating death. And so Jesus can ask the question, why have you forsaken me? Why have you let me not bring the kingdom into existence here? Now, what's the Father's answer to that? Presumably here's this mystery that if this didn't happen, then the devil wouldn't have done what he did. That's Lewis's and Christus Victor kind of approach, the mystery approach to the atonement. The other one is, another possible one is if it's the case that God wants that everybody who is in the Holocaust, everybody who has suffered in life, can't shake their fist at God and say, you don't know what it's like. And he's like, completely innocent, no reason to do it, suffered on the cross for hours, right? He could have made it shorter. He didn't have to. He could have died another way. He chose that one, I think, so that people in his creation can reasonably say, like, okay, you did the hard thing. You came down here and did this with us. Presumably, reportedly, one of the worst, most painful ways to die out there, excruciating, comes from the word itself.
So 2 points.
There's not a lock on that, but it's a plausible explanation.
It's
So
possible that's underdetermined.
Is love an essential property?
Yes, I think so. Now, what you're about to go into, an argument has been made for this, that in order for God to love, and Richard Swinburne made this argument, that in order for God to love, love has to be expressed or it's not real. In order to be expressed, there has to be two people. But then he goes one step further and says, but in order for, love is not complete between two people unless you share that love with a third. And so there has to be a third one, and that's how you get three from the Trinity.
The last part's a little ad hoc.
Yeah, it feels a little ad hoc. So of the two explanations, obviously I prefer my own because I'm going to claim that it comes necessarily out of the properties that we ascribe to a maximally great being, whereas his requires you to it's not a bad claim, but it requires you to say, as two parents, your love together is best expressed in when you share it with a child. That's a different and richer kind of love. But then also, okay, well, what about other children? So why stop at three is my question to Swinburne, right? Mm-hmm. And Swinburne doesn't, maybe he's got, I haven't asked him, but I haven't seen in the writing any particularly great answer to that question. And of course, I'm predisposed.
Right, but what, you said without creation, God's not the Trinity.
I don't buy, yeah, that's right. If it were the case that the actual world, the world that God decided on, was one where he doesn't create anything. He sort of atemporally looks at it all as nope, every one of those options is a bad option. I'm not doing it. It's just I'm gonna stick just with God. Then you don't get two other persons of the Trinity. But because God always, so to speak, atemporally intended to do this, there always will have been atemporally three persons of the Trinity. So the Trinity is co-eternal. Another way of putting it in Craig's language, there is no time t where three persons of the Trinity do not exist. I will go further and say there's no metaphysical state, S, in which the Trinity does not exist.
Right, but there's a logical world in which there's no Trinity existing, God's existing, atemporal.
There's a logically possible world in which God exists, but the Trinity doesn't.
Right, but in that possible world is God loving.
Yes.
There's
So
no
loving,
question.
so because you can, there's love, can one love oneself? If you're a Christian, you're forced to say yes. Why? What's the second commandment? Yeah, God implies that the level at which you should love other people is the level to which you love yourself, which entails self-love as possible. So God could love the greatest, could love everything that's good, simply in virtue of loving himself.
But perfectly? I mean, so
Define
you
perfect.
kind of
Define perfect.
completely, fully.
Yeah.
So you sort of sidestepped the statement before by saying, well, Swinburne says that in order for love to exist, there must be at least two people. Well, I just think it's necessary, and so you can have it with one person. That was kind of what you said.
You're saying I said that,
That's
or
what
I'm saying Swinburne said
That's what you implied, at least. You said, but I just believe that love is a necessary property, and therefore God had it. But that's kind of sidestepping.
Sidestepping what?
The definition of love. Does love not...
So love is a benevolent, selfless regard. The problem with the definition of being a selfless regard is, I think selfless regard only is for love expressed between two different beings.
Right.
So selfish love is a benevolent regard minus the selfless portion of it. So what is benevolent? Benevolent means it wants the good for. And if God is good, and he has himself, whatever that means, then he has the good. In fact, he has the best possible good because he has himself. He lacks nothing
I
in
wonder
himself.
if you're extrapolating a little bit too far on love yourself.
Why?
Also, because I take care of myself, obviously, sometimes I could take care of myself a little better, but maybe not so much Chick-fil-A or whatever it is, right?
Chick-fil-A, you don't think Chick-fil-A is one of the ultimate expressions of love in itself?
If it was, maybe it should be open on Sunday. Just saying.
It's only because of holiness that they're not.
Yeah, right.
That is the truth, yeah. Okay.
But that is a care and desire to care for, there's, how do I explain this? So there's a mind, you have a mind, but you also have a body, and it's not, they're co-joined, but they're not the same.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to say that Christ was saying, love your neighbor as yourself, meaning that you, as only an unembodied mind, can have perfect love within itself. Maybe what he's saying in context is you take care of your body in a way that is meaningful. You need to take care of other people in the same way. So that's what I mean. I think you may be extrapolating beyond the text to kind of imply that. Does that make sense?
I think so, but I didn't see a contradiction between what the definition was loving other people and the definition of loving oneself, other than you're saying in this temporal world, these are the constraints and limitations. If what you say is...
You took that, I think you may have taken that verse beyond its intent to say that you could have complete love just within yourself.
Oh, I didn't mean to say the verse said that. I meant to just simply say that the verse implies that you can love yourself. That God believes that self-love is a thing. That's all I meant for it.
But then you took that to saying, if that's true, then God could love himself in a complete way.
No, I meant to say that God could love himself. And I point out is at the beginning of time when it's just God, do you think that he failed to love himself?
No, but I do think that you need at least two people.
Why?
Because by definition, I think...
Can you love yourself without being two people?
So that's where I'm going back to, what does it mean to love yourself?
But I'm just asking, can you?
Can I love myself?
Yes.
I can care for myself, and yes.
Without being two people?
Without being two people. This is, again...
But again, if you have a power to
do
it, then I think... But I will say this.
Too far.
If it's something that you can do, then in virtue of a power, then it's a power God also has.
So I can love myself, but not in the same way that I can love another person.
I agree with that. But the point is, if you can love yourself, and that's a good thing, that's a good power that you have. God being omnipotent has all good powers, so he has that power too.
Correct. Is it complete love? Is it perfect love?
I'm going to stop there and say QED. It doesn't have to be complete and perfect. It just is love. Now, I happen to think that any love God expresses is complete and perfect. Why is any love God expresses complete and perfect? Because He is perfect, and He is the greatest possible good. So whatever perfect is, whatever that final, most advanced, whatever great state of perfect, that's how God loves. So if God loves others that way, He also loves Himself that way. QED.
I disagrue with that.
Fair enough.
I think
So-
he's
Show me where, though.
So I
Sorry,
still
I
have a
think
problem
it's
with
good.
your view of atemporality in that, in your view, right, like, to conceptualize what I'm talking about, let's say that your reality, right, your diamond of reality is a swimming pool, right, and God makes a swimming pool, but I don't think He has to get wet, right, and I think that God can interact with the swimming pool without getting wet. I look at when Christ gets baptized, and the Father, right, the Holy Spirit descends as a dove, and the Father says, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased."
Good point.
This seems to just completely smash this view of the Trinity to bits. In that, in that view, God is truly unable to act on the world. God the Father, He just becomes this unable observer, and there's this continuous problem.
Why do you think He's unable?
Because He would be descending into time into the Trinity, and God is no longer atemporal.
You're forgetting the third person.
Okay, but there's still the problem of
not okay.
no.
No,
Okay,
okay,
your
yeah.
point. So, but there's still the problem of one, how do you know that God can't create the swimming pool without getting wet? And two, there's the problem.
you're gonna hate this answer. You're gonna hate this answer. But what does it mean?
Hold on.
Okay, all right.
Two.
All right.
And two, atemporality. There's still this issue of you see. Oh, He steps into time as if into time is itself temporal, or like atemporality implies that like He can, we can't really conceptualize what God the Father's experience is, but like He's like, oh, there's reality, right? Like He can look around it, He can see the beginning, He can see the end, right? And so there seems to be this problem that when Christ creates the world,
I disagree with that. I think what you just said there, where He kind of looks at it, where He manipulates it around that is exactly the kind of thinking that we all naturally want to do, because that's kind of how we would do it. I think that's completely wrong. So I think that you have to throw that away and say instead, I forget what movie does it, but any movie where they freeze time, and like you can see almost like the sparkling of the dust motes in the air and that kind of thing.
Matrix.
Yeah, Matrix slows it down. I don't know if they ever stop it.
Of course, if it's sparkling, then it's changing.
Yeah, but it's in virtue of you moving around that sees it, which is the problem there. If there were what's contained, the perfection that's contained in one of those moments, assuming it's a perfect moment, is the perfection that's the atemporal mind of God. But it's all good and true things in that frozen, so to speak, time. Now, I would say so.
Right, but
I haven't answered you. Well,
that doesn't answer that. In
your
beginning, when it's the
administrative timeout. Administrative timeout. There's 60 seconds left in the class. Okay. Do you want me to attempt to answer it in 60 seconds, or do you want to take this up next time?
Let's take it next time.
Okay.
No, 60 seconds.
Now 60
now
seconds.
40 seconds.
Yes.
So are you going to include the Hawkins thing when you bring up the Kalam?
Yeah, so I'll tell you my strategy there is I'm going to mention all that mathematical gobbledygook with the purpose of turning around, simply showing the audience and the opposition of like, I can actually, you want to interact at this level, let's do it in the rebuttals. So you can't accuse me of being ignorant of the fact. I'm going to turn around and say, yeah, Hawking says it, this is how he does it, and this is why he's wrong. And then assume that everybody's in agreement, like, oh yeah, of course, if you use a Wick rotation between two smooth manifolds, and then simply, and he extends in the complex plane. Once you pull the complex plane out of it, imaginary time disappears, and you're back to a force space, in a de Sitter space, in a de Sitter universe, and of course you have time still.
And it's going to blow over.
Right, that's not going to work. Right, so what I'm going to do is go into 30 seconds, 20 seconds of mathematical gobbledygook, immediately translate it into English, and then assume that Loftus is going to be like, well, I'm not going to take him on that one. Or alternately, yeah, let's do it, because I'm willing to talk down to the nth level on it.
Is there going to be a Q&A in this?
Yes, sir.
There is going to be Q&A?
Yep, at the end.
Did you get loaded up? No, I got a question.
He already sent me his question. We're ready for it.
I'm going to have a question for him.
Fire away. Thank you guys for your continued time. So I haven't sent out more of it. I would like to send out some of the pictures. Well, I didn't get to drawing the pictures today. I would love to send out some of the pictures of the slides this week, a couple at a time, and get your thoughts on them. And if any suggestions on how to make it better, because the pictures are going to be very important, in my opinion.
Really quick on
Because the
that.
pictures are going to be stuff like that, where we draw this kind of thing.
Really quick on that, Ben Mel is the guy that's operating those. So if you want anything on the main slides, the back slides, whatever, we can set it up.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. All right. Thank you all very much for the help. Greatly appreciated.
We're just arguing.
Well,